I was peeling apples in the kitchen when her whisper cut through the air like a blade. "Grandma! Run!" The sound was barely there, but my body understood before my mind. The air smelled of old dust and fresh metal. The open window brought a damp wind from the quiet suburbs of a Tuesday night, and instinctively I dropped the knife into the sink as I listened to the creak that wasn't from our house. The old wood in the hallway responded with a slow creak, and my granddaughter's small hand tightened around my wrist. I didn't argue, didn't ask why. I just walked quickly to the back door, my heart pounding in time with an imaginary siren, and we stepped out into the dark backyard, the smell of cut grass mingling with the smell of rain. My granddaughter Emma is 7 years old and has a polite silence she learned between school, church, and Sunday lunches at our home in Bloomington, Illinois. Her mother, my daughter, works double shifts at the hospital. Her father has lived 2 towns away since the separation. Here at home, everything has always been simple. The kettle whistles at 6. The newspaper arrives at 6:15. The dog sleeps at the foot of the sofa. That night, however, the digital clock flashed 9:37 p.m., and I remembered my own mother's advice. If the house talks when it shouldn't, listen with your feet. I was already out the door when the back door creaked behind us, and the wind brought a smell of burning plastic that didn't originate from our block. The neighborhood looked like a faded photograph. The porch lights like tiny moons. The cars lined up as if waiting for someone to start. The streetlight in the corner creaking under the weight of an old transformer. Emma pulled me toward the side of the house, behind the chicken coop that remained from the previous owner. I could hear, inside, a drawer being opened with the patience of someone who knows the house better than they should. The hallway floor responded with a short groan, like a held breath. I thought of the rifle locked in the basement and the phone left on the counter, and felt the punishment of a habit. "I'll be back in a second," I almost said to my granddaughter, but her gaze held me there, in the darkness, where the smell of wet earth seemed to insist with an ancient urgency. It's funny how the mind builds paths. 2 days earlier, I'd found rubber marks along the back fence, as if a bicycle had skidded there. Yesterday, I noticed a strange chip on the back door, next to the lock, which I attributed to the weather. And last Saturday, the porch's motion, sensor blinked at 3 in the morning, which I blamed on a raccoon I'd never seen. 3 details, insignificant on their own, but at that moment, they were a map converging on the kitchen, where I used to feel invincible with an apron and a paring knife. The rustling of the hallway curtains assured me it wasn't the wind. I led Emma to the shelter of the old oak tree, where the bark smells like a wet book and the resin holds secrets from summers gone by. The puppy, Max, growled softly, a low, humble sound, as if asking permission to be brave. From there, I could see the darker rectangle that was the living room window. A shadow passed diagonally, cutting off the little light coming from the street. It wasn't tall, but it moved with slender intention, the stride of someone who'd done this before. My mouth felt dry, and the weight of responsibility tightened my chest. My granddaughter pressed against me, Max ready to bark and denounce me, and a house that had suddenly ceased to be a refuge and become a stage. I grabbed my cell phone from my coat pocket. Miraculous, I hadn't left it on the counter, and dialed a 911 with fingers that trembled in a rhythm I hadn't recognized since my husband's funeral. The operator answered with a, "What's the emergency?" as practiced as a prayer, and I quietly described every noise, every shadow, every smell. She asked me to stay on the line, asked if there were any weapons in the house, if I knew anyone who might be there, if there was a chance it was a family member. I thought about my daughter's separation and the ex-son-in-law's calm deception, about his brother who was always on call somewhere, and that strange visit from a man from the power company who stared too much at our lock last week. I replied that I wasn't sure of anything, and that was the first truth of the night. As we waited, a soft sound of glass working in its groove cut through the air. Whoever was inside opened the refrigerator. I could feel the chill seeping into my stomach, as if I'd drunk well water. I remembered the stories that circulate at church meetings. Homes broken into by people familiar with the routine. Medicine theft. Documents stolen as if they were worth little. The strain of the next few days with insurance. New locks. Suspicious glances at their own neighborhood. And in the midst of it all, children who learn too early the difference between footsteps and the sound of danger. Emma breathed shallowly, leaning against me, and whispered again. He's looking for something. Grandma, it didn't feel like a break-in of opportunity. There was method in the delay, calm in the choice of what to open. The silverware drawer, I heard the metallic rattle, the medicine cabinet above the sink. I felt in my memory the dry click of the hinge as the shadow fiddled with bottles I'd combed that morning. Then the almost soft sound of envelopes being sorted, that rough, thin sound of paper scraping against paper. It was the month's bills, bank letters, the home insurance. The you. Intruder didn't want the TV, didn't want the microwave. He wanted our papers, our routines, our openings. That, more than anything, chilled me. The attendant said the patrol car was 5 minutes away. 5 minutes when someone is rewriting their life in your kitchen is 5 winters. I smelled the sweet smell of gasoline that sometimes wafts from the garage when I leave the garage closed for too long, and wondered if I'd forgotten to unlock the inner door. Max pricked up his ears, alert as a movie soldier, and I stroked his neck to plead for patience in a language dogs have always known. The street light on the corner snapped. A cricket interrupted the concert, and the world seemed to hold its breath with us. My mind raced back to the past few months. My daughter's separation, my ex's unanswered messages, his insistence on getting some old documents that, he said, were in a folder in our basement, a folder I swore I'd never seen. 2 weeks ago, a thin, unshaven man in a nondescript cap knocked on the door offering to do fence maintenance. He politely declined and photographed the front of the house for an estimate. Yesterday, a black pickup truck with dark tint film drove incredibly slowly across our lawn, as if searching for a specific number on a street everyone in the neighborhood knew. I preferred to call it all old lady paranoia. At the time, the right word was clues. I heard footsteps now, heading toward the hallway that led to the room where I keep my husband's mementos, still intact, like a small museum of flowery fabrics and stored perfumes. The intruder opened the door. The hinge gave away the secret. There was something desecrating in the idea of someone running their hand through the quilt I sewed the last autumn we spent together, of someone opening the drawer where the silver bracelet sleeps next to the wedding photos. Jealousy of the past is a current that pulls us back, and I felt a cold, clean, almost practical anger, like the anger of a seamstress when she sees someone carelessly cut a rare fabric. It's hard to describe courage that isn't brave, courage that's merely necessary. I leaned into Emma's ear and told her that if I asked her, she would run to Mr. McAllister's house, 2 gates away, and knock until he opened. She nodded with an adult's seriousness borrowed from a child. The phone chimed. The operator asked me to describe the intruder if possible. Small, agile, knows his way around, I said, knowing that wasn't going to fit into any form. The wheels of a car turned the corner with a crunch of gravel. For a moment I thought it was the police, but they drove straight past, carrying the promise of salvation like an untimely garbage truck. I knew the basement had a peculiarity. A tilt-and-turn window in the back, misaligned since last spring, when the wood swelled with humidity. I'd been putting off fixing it because emergency services like to line up. If someone were rummaging through papers, they might go downstairs to look for that missing folder. And the basement holds more than tools. It holds the traces of who we've been. That bothered me, as if someone had pulled up a chair in the middle of a prayer. I took a deep breath and tried to recall every creak of every wooden step inside to anticipate movements. Emma squeezed my hand again, this time not out of fear, but with the kind of bond that only exists between two people on the same side of a door. "Grandma, it was Mommy's voice that woke me," she whispered, her eyes wide in the darkness. "She told me to tell you to run." The night contracted around those words. I almost said they were the impressions of a child with a racing heart, but I preferred to keep that signal like a dry match in my pocket. Sometimes life gives warnings in voices we respect without question. Then came the sound that left no doubt, the basement door creaking like old rope. The intruder was descending. One step, pause, another step, breathing. Two more, a light thud. Perhaps he'd bumped into the bike rack. I knew that rhythm like I know the sound of my own sewing machine, the basement saying, "Someone's where they shouldn't be." Max growled again, louder, and I hugged him around the neck, feeling the vibration of his chest against my arm. If the intruder had entered through the kitchen, he'd planned to exit through the basement. People who know where to move also know where to disappear. The distant drone of a siren began to weave the night beside us, a blue thread buried in the darkness. The dispatcher said the units were arriving on Maple Street, a block away. I visualized the route, the lights sweeping across the facade of the elementary school, the intersection with the traffic light that always turns too yellow, the curve that casts the shadows of the oak trees on the asphalt like long fingers. I thought of the intruder hearing that too and quickening his pace, perhaps deciding what to take, what to leave, what to hide. I felt the weight of my own name in this house, and for the first time wondered if the routine I was so proud of had become a manual for intruders. As the first police car pulled into the street, the blue reflection hit the living room window and exploded at us like lightning without thunder. The intruder stopped. Sometimes silence says, "It's over." Other times it says, "It's begun." This time, he said, "Get ready." I heard the sound of something being put back, a paper hastily gathered, a drawer slamming shut. Emma held her breath. Max looked from me to the house, as if asking if it was time to be loud, and I, with a calm I don't know where from, realized that that night wasn't just about a burglar. It was a moral inventory that life takes of us without warning. The officers searched the side of the house. The flashlight traced the ground near. The chicken coop and a low voice explained our position to the other. When the beam found us, for a second, I saw my own face reflected like a badly taken portrait. Pale, the wrinkled skin carrying the night, the eyes full of that shine that isn't tears but survival. Emma lifted her chin with a seriousness that reminded me of her mother at her age. Max wagged his tail silently, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. One of the officers raised his hand in a clear, "Stay put" gesture, and the other flashlight moved towards the basement door. I could feel the house vibrating through the grass where we crouched. Heavy footsteps, curt orders, the radio crackling with static and codes that sounded like a secret language. They walked around the rear, tilt and turn window, noticed the gap in the swollen wood, touched the glass as if they could read the story of the invasion in it. For a moment I felt guilty for each delayed repair, as if the oversight were an invitation. Still, there was a flicker of bitter gratitude. If the window was crooked, perhaps it was precisely this that had trapped him, delaying his escape. "Stay there," the older officer repeated, and I could hear in his tone the experience of someone who had seen homes like mine become the scene of terror. He gave a discreet signal, and two officers entered the kitchen with the caution of someone treading unfamiliar ground. Within seconds, the clipped, spine-chilling commands came. "Show your hands! Get on the floor! Drop that! Each order transformed my once familiar kitchen into a theater of domestic war. The night outside seemed to follow everything. The neighbors' curtains moved like curious eyes. Cell phone lights illuminated faces in the shadows. The crickets had stopped, as if even nature awaited the outcome. Emma breathed next to me, trying to match my calm rhythm, but her chest rose and fell too quickly. I held her hand and pressed it, as if silently swearing that no harm would come to her. Suddenly a dry sound cracked the air, not a gunshot, but the sound of wood giving way. I recognized it immediately. It was the old shelf in the basement, the one my husband always promised to reinforce but never managed. The noise echoed as if it were inside my own head. Then a muffled human groan sounded, a mixture of pain and frustration. The radio crackled and someone said, "We found it." And another replied, "Reinforcement on the east side." I didn't need to see it to understand. He'd tried to climb out the window, gotten tangled up, and that's where they caught him. The intruder was removed from the side of the house, hands behind his back, his face illuminated by the flashlights like an animal, caught in a trap. When I got a better look, a shiver ran down my spine. It was my daughter's ex-husband's brother-in-law, the same one who, months earlier, had spent a few days on the couch in our living room, claiming to need some time to get organized. I remembered him opening my refrigerator with intimacy, scanning the corners of the house as if he were decorating. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't coincidence, it was preparation. There was no immediate relief, only a heavy silence. Emma looked at me, searching for an explanation I didn't have. Max barked once, as if to end the threat, but I felt it wasn't an end, but an uncomfortable beginning. If someone so close could betray our trust, what else was hidden behind the walls that night? The 911 operator was still on the line, and I thanked her with a drawn-out "thank you," heavy with years of slurring. Emma leaned her head against my shoulder and began to cry softly, finally allowing the tension to find release. Max moved closer, pressing himself against my leg, as if to reassure me that the danger had passed. The sounds of the neighborhood slowly returned. A gate slamming, a distant car, a train whistle on the horizon. But within me, peace was still far away. The police approached and asked us to tell them what we had seen and heard. I explained the footsteps, the overturned furniture, the strange smell. I told them about the rubber marks next to the fence, the black pickup truck, the man who had come to fix fences, but seemed more interested in taking pictures. As I spoke, I realized that each forgotten detail now formed a larger puzzle, as if the story had been being written behind our backs for weeks, and only that night had we realized how to read it. One of the officers, the younger one, asked if there was any specific item the intruder might be looking for. I hesitated. Then I remembered my ex-son-in-law's insistence on getting an old briefcase he said was in the basement. A briefcase I'd never seen. I told the officer this and saw his gaze harden. He took note as if he already knew the item was important. The police suggested we spend the night elsewhere for safety. I agreed. I looked inside my house, now lit by flashlights and red and blue lights reflecting off the walls, and felt a lump in my throat. It was as if every piece of furniture had lost its innocence. Every corner seemed suspicious. It wasn't the same house anymore, and perhaps never would be again. We entered, accompanied by the officers, to retrieve some clothes and documents. The smell of metal and sweat mingled with the faint lavender scent of the diffuser still running in the living room. Emma held my hand tightly, her eyes darting over every detail. On the kitchen counter, a stack of open envelopes betrayed the intruder's interest. Bills, bank statements, papers that held more to our lives than any piece of jewelry. As I opened, a drawer in the sideboard I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was an empty space where a brown folder should have been, one of those common cardboard ones. I'd never kept anything there other than appliance manuals. But the space was marked, as if something had been removed or replaced recently. I couldn't tell if it was a misremembering or a planned manipulation. I told the police officer, and he asked us not to touch anything else. Emma looked at me, and her voice still cracking said, "Grandma, Mommy told you not to let anyone touch Grandma's papers." My heart sank. I hadn't told her about the silver bracelet, about my husband's old letters, about family documents stored in boxes. How could she repeat that? The weight of the mystery seemed greater than the invasion itself. As we gathered our things, I felt my home's gaze on me. Every photograph on the walls seemed to ask me how I hadn't noticed the signs before. Every chair, every curtain, every door creaked differently as if holding secrets. The invasion hadn't just been physical, but emotional, a theft of trust. As we walked with the officers to the patrol car, I noticed the neighbors watching in silence, some with hands in their pockets, others with expressions of astonishment. But I knew that by the next morning the story would be spread by word of mouth, full of versions and suppositions. What they wouldn't know was the most important detail, the voice that whispered to Emma and prompted her to alert me. This secret, for now, would remain just between us. On the way to my sister's house, where we would sleep that night, Emma curled up in the back seat, finally giving in to exhaustion. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her eyes closed, but her expression wasn't peaceful. It was as if she was still listening to something I couldn't hear. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as doubt crept through me. Who, after all, had planted that non-existent folder in our story? And what were they really looking for inside my house? When we arrived at our destination, the sky was beginning to lighten with a cold dawn blue. I got out of the car with heavy steps, feeling that each decision that night would be just the first chapter of something bigger. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, even after locking the gate to my sister's house. I knew, deep down, that this wouldn't end anytime soon. That early morning at my sister Anne's house, the silence seemed heavier than the night before. I sat on the edge of the couch with Emma already asleep in the guest room and listened to the insistent ticking of the antique clock Anne had inherited from our mother. The sound, which should have been comforting, reminded me every second that I was away from home, but it was more than that. Each tick seemed to accuse me of my failure to protect the house where I had raised my daughter and now welcomed my granddaughter. My sister appeared with a cup of tea, the scent of chamomile filling the air, and asked quietly if I wanted to talk. I just nodded, but the pressure in my chest was so strong that the words slipped out. And he didn't go there by accident. He knew what to look for. She frowned, settling down beside me, and waited for me to continue. Then I told her about the folder I'd never seen before, but which seemed to have been taken from the drawer, and about the phrase Emma had repeated, her mother's voice, telling them not to let anyone touch Grandma's papers. Anne held my hand and said maybe it was just a frightened child's imagination, but I knew my granddaughter. Emma might only be 7, but there was a quiet maturity about her, as if she'd inherited the family's keen perception. "No, Anne," I insisted. "She heard something, and I feel like someone messed with something they shouldn't have." My sister, who had always believed in signs, didn't contradict me. She simply made the sign of the cross and asked me to pray before trying to sleep. I tried. I lay down in the room next to Emma and closed my eyes, but my mind spun like a rusty wheel. Every memory of the intruder, every detail of the ransacked house came back in flashes. The rattle of the silverware drawer, the sound of the refrigerator glass, the creak of the basement door, and above all, the feeling of invasion that didn't end with handcuffs. It was as if someone was still inside, rummaging through secrets. I didn't even know I had. When I finally fell asleep, I had a strange dream. I was walking through my basement, but it wasn't dark. The walls were covered with old photos, letters, and diaries, as if the past had been pasted there, forcing me to see. In the corner, a brown folder sat on the table. Opening it, I found newspaper clippings, all with headlines about disappearances and old debts. And at the bottom, a letter written in my own handwriting, but which I never remembered writing. I woke with my heart racing, as if I'd run a marathon. I got up slowly so as not to wake Emma, and went to Anne's kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee brought me a sense of normalcy. But as I glanced at the calendar on the wall, I noticed something. Repeating, dates circled in a red pen, coinciding with days when I'd noticed strange things in my house. A coincidence? Or was I connecting dots that didn't exist? The uncertainty was as suffocating as the fear. In the morning, the police called, asking me to come to the station to give a formal statement. Emma stayed with Anne, playing in the yard, with her dog, and I went alone. On the way, the city seemed different. The familiar streets held an air of suspicion. The faces at the traffic lights seemed to hide intentions. Even the cold Illinois wind seemed to carry secrets. I wondered how many houses, behind the curtains, held stories similar to mine. At the police station, the smell of stale coffee and old paper filled the air. A middle-aged officer led me to a small room with gray walls and a scratched metal table. He asked me to recount everything in detail, and I did. About Emma's whisper, the sense of danger, the footsteps, the missing briefcase. The officer took notes silently, only nodding occasionally. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "You mentioned your ex-son-in-law's brother-in-law. Do you think someone might have sent him?" The question weighed heavily on me. Warrant. Until then, I thought of him as the sole culprit, perhaps driven by anger, need, or revenge. But warrant? That broadened the picture to something I didn't want to imagine. I shook my head, unsure of how to respond. The officer didn't insist, simply saying they'd stay in touch and handing me a card with a direct number. "Anything strange, call immediately," he reassured. On the way back to Anne's house, I passed my street. I saw my house from afar, still with the yellow police tape on the front door. It was like looking at a bruised body I couldn't touch. The lawn was intact. The flowers I'd planted in the summer still stood bravely, but home was no longer the same. The sight made me cry silently, driving slowly to Anne's gate. Emma ran to me when I arrived and hugged my legs tightly. Her curious eyes scanned me silently, as if asking what the police had said. I didn't want to scare her further and simply said, "They'll take care of us." But the statement rang false even to me. Emma, with her sensitivity, noticed. She didn't respond, just held my hand firmly. That night, while we were having dinner with Anne, the house phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered with a shaky voice. On the other end, there was only breathing, long, slow, heavy. "Who's there?" I asked 3 times. No answer, just a sharp click as I hung up. I replaced the receiver with cold hands, and Emma watched me silently, as if she'd heard every detail of the call. "Was it him?" Anne asked. I didn't know how to answer. Maybe it was just a prank call, someone calling by chance. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was someone reminding me that even with the intruder arrested, there were more people involved. People who might have been much closer than I imagined. That same morning, Emma had another nightmare. She woke up screaming my name and saying someone was in the basement right there at Aunt Anne's house. I ran to the bedroom, sat beside her and hugged her. Her heart was pounding and her wide eyes searched the darkness. "Calm down, my love. We're safe here," I whispered, but deep inside, doubt burned. What if she was hearing something I couldn't? The next day brought gray skies and a cold wind that made the trees bend. I was walking through Anne's yard trying to gather my thoughts when I spotted something strange. Near the back gate, there was a fresh tire track, as if a car had stopped there overnight. The ground was still damp from the rain, and the mark was fresh. My stomach clenched. Someone had come here. I didn't say anything to Anne or Emma at that moment. I went back inside and made pancakes as if nothing had happened, but inside, the tension was growing. I knew the break-in wasn't an isolated incident, and that the missing briefcase held a value I didn't yet understand. And worse, that someone was willing to follow me wherever I went. As night fell, Emma approached me, already in her pajamas, and said in a voice far too calm for her age, "Grandma, Mommy said they won't stop until they succeed." Those words chilled my blood. There was no way a little girl could make up something so specific. I hugged her tightly, without answering, because the truth was cruel. I, too, believed I wouldn't stop there. The next morning, I woke with a pounding head and the nagging feeling that someone had been at the door during the night, even though there had been no real noise to justify the feeling. I got up slowly, put water on to boil, and watched through Anne's kitchen window at the back gate, where the tire track still slashed across the damp ground, like a hurried signature from someone who didn't want to be seen, but needed to leave. A message, and in that rubber line I read the unspoken message, "I know where you are." Before Emma woke up, I called the police officer who had assisted me at the station, and accurately described the tire track, the height of the gate, the approximate time of the rain, and the silence that followed the early morning. He asked me not to touch anything, suggested taking photos from various angles, and said he would come by later with someone from forensics, but his voice, polite and firm, didn't cover the hole that opens when we understand that danger has wheels and memory, that it travels streets, recognizes facades, and is guided by other people's routines. I explained to Anne that it wasn't panic, it was method. If they found us here, it was because there was a way to track us, and that the first step would be to check pockets, bags, the car, any object that might emit a signal. And her eyes widened, asking if this wasn't something out of a movie. I replied that a movie is the name we give to the reality we don't want to believe, and I opened my bag with a care that bordered on ritual, turning the lining out, running my hand along the seams, taking out my wallet, keys, coins, receipts, until my fingers hit a cold disc the size of a 50-cent piece, held together by double-sided tape in the inside pocket I rarely use. I'd seen pictures on TV and heard talk at church about small trackers used to help locate things, but there, in the lining of my own bag, that silent disc had another function. I called Anne over to look, and her hands trembled slightly as she took out the tweezers to remove the object, and I felt a chill rise up my legs like a fever from fright, because that explained the tire track on the gate, and also explained the silent call from the night before. It wasn't to talk, it was to confirm where we were. Emma came into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, and noticed our start before she even understood what it was. I placed the tracker on a saucer, and in the simplest tone I could, explained that someone had glued a "Find Things" button to Grandma's bag without permission, and that's how they knew we were at Aunt Anne's house. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and fear that didn't match her 7-year-old self, asking if it was the same person who had gone through our house, and I said it probably was, because people who want our papers also want to know where we've been. I called the police officer again, who instructed me to put the object away without touching it again, inside a clean bag, and said that it could be important evidence. I asked if I could continue with my plans for the day, or if I should stay inside, and he said that if I went out, I should be accompanied, be attentive, and report any changes, because whoever installed this isn't messing around. I hung up and leaned my forehead against the refrigerator door for a few seconds, breathing slowly, trying to cover the child that still lives inside me with a blanket of adult courage. I decided the next step would be the bank. Shuffled documents and paperwork often meant open accounts, requested cards, loans in the name of someone who didn't apply, and I couldn't bear to find out too late. I called Anne to stay with Emma and drove to my branch on the main street, my hands firm on the steering wheel and my gaze sweeping the rearview mirrors, intersections, and cars moving too slowly. Because from that tracker, I had learned that surveillance isn't paranoia. It's hygiene for those who want to stay alive. At the bank, the manager, who had known me by name for years, welcomed me to a cubicle smelling of dry paper and cold air. Conditioning and I was as direct as ever. I explained the break-in, the briefcase, the tracker, the family connections, and asked him to immediately check for any credit applications, address changes, or unusual withdrawal attempts. He typed quickly, called up 2 screens, bit his lower lip, and finally said that there were, indeed, 2 recent inquiries on my credit report that didn't come from my accounts, as well as a pre-approved card application with another institution. Pending confirmation. I felt the ground give way a little, but I didn't let myself fall. I asked for a block, I froze my credit at all 3 branches, I wrote down protocols like someone praying the rosary, and I authorized alerts on my phone for every banking transaction, because I understood, right then and there, with the air conditioning, humming, that my name had become an object of interest, and that, for people like that, a name is a bargaining chip worth more than a television or microwave. I left the bank with an envelope of papers, a chill that wouldn't go away, and the conviction that the folder, the one I didn't remember, might be a map for people specialized in slicing other people's lives into numbers and signatures. The way back, my cell phone vibrated with an unknown number. I answered on speakerphone, prepared for silence again, but this time there was a voice. Male, level, unhurried, saying only, "Don't file a report because of the phone. It was a mistake. We can talk," and that "we can talk" came with the false calm of someone offering poisoned tea in an impeccable kitchen. I hung up without answering and memorized the last 4 digits of the number as if they were license plates, repeating them until I reached the corner of Anne, where I stopped the car 2 blocks ahead to make sure no one was following us. I told Anne about calling the police officer who told me to register the number. Half an hour later, 2 police officers knocked on the gate with a briefcase and gloves, photographed the tracker, measured it, wrapped it, and asked practical questions. When I noticed it, where I usually leave my purse, who had access to it? In the last few days, if there were any visitors at home or at my daughter's hospital, and I told her everything, the man with the fence, the truck, my brother-in-law, my ex's colleagues, the trips to and from the hospital to pick up Emma, and the more I talked, the more I felt like the last few months fit into a calendar of ignored signs. Emma stood on the porch with the dog, drawing with chalk on the ground, and every now and then she lifted her head as if checking our safety. When the police left, she came and placed her hand on mine with the sweet firmness of someone who has already understood that affection is also a survival strategy, and whispered, "Mommy said the next step is the hospital," and I swallowed hard. Because if there's one place where documents circulate in many people's names, it's a hospital. Temporary badges, test requests, registrations, and I thought of the immense parking lots under white light that make everyone look the same. I decided to follow the intuition that came from my granddaughter's voice. I called hospital security, asked to speak to someone I trusted, and, in the most cordial words I could muster, asked if they had noticed a thin man wearing an unbranded cap and unshaven. Circling near the employee parking lot, I described him as someone painting a portrait, and the head of security remained silent for 2 seconds before saying that, yes, in recent weeks, cameras had recorded an individual with that description, loitering around cars during shift changes, always keeping his distance, so as not to disturb. I went there early in the afternoon, with Anne driving and Emma in the back seat, and asked to see, in the presence of security, the parking lot where my daughter usually parks. The chief led us through corridors smelling of disinfectant and polished steel elevators. And as we walked through the door to the outside area, the cold wind bit my skin and brought that constant noise of a hospital that sounds like a sea of metal, cars, gurneys, voices, wheels. And in column C12, I recognized the space where I'd waited so many times for my tired daughter to leave. The chief pointed a camera, said she'd take pictures, and there I was, staring at the cement floor, and noticed a small piece shining 3 steps from the curb. Another record, the same as the one in my bag, dented at the edge, as if it had been stepped on or removed in a hurry. I suppressed the urge to ring, called the chief, who took a step back and called a guard, and within minutes the place became a small, controlled scene. Photos, gloves, a bag, labels, and the childish, brutal feeling that someone had turned my daughter's routine, a doctor on double shifts, into a chessboard. The security chief commented in a low voice that in cases like this, there are often attempts to access employee lockers, HR documents, parking passes, and I imagined unfamiliar hands feeling for badges, reading last names, cross-referencing information like someone putting together a puzzle that ends at the door to our dining room. On the way back, Emma from the back seat asked what debt was with the seriousness with which one asks, "What is time?" And I explained with the honesty befitting a child. Debt is when someone takes something that isn't theirs, promising to return it, and sometimes using someone else's name to do so. And she bit her lip, thought, and said, "So they took your name," and it hurt to hear such a precise definition in her voice, as if childhood had agreed to sign a receipt for loss in order to continue. Before nightfall, I sat with Anne at the kitchen table, and we spread a to-do list on the table in thick pen. Freeze credit done, notify homeowner's insurance company, pending, change locks, schedule, inspect cars from underneath with a flashlight, today, install cameras in the front and back, urgent, talk to my daughter's bank and the hospital's HR department, tomorrow. And at the end of the list, I underlined 3 times, understand that file, because all this persecution had a purpose, and documents are the compass of those who navigate other people's lives for dirty purposes. That night, the phone rang again from a different number, and I answered with the firm voice that age has given me. The voice on the other end, perhaps. The same one said he was willing to return what he had taken if I stopped the police and the hospital, and I asked, "What exactly did you take?" And he, after a studied pause, replied, "A set of papers that aren't yours." And the phrase lit a match in my memory. In the trunk in my living room, next to my husband's letters, there was an old plastic folder with documents from my mother-in-law, certificates, liens on an old house, an expired life insurance policy that I had never thrown away out of respect. Had it turned to gold in the wrong hands? I hung up, sat on the couch, and Emma came to me in her cloud pajamas, resting her head on my shoulder. Her body smelled of simple soap and warm home air, and that scent restored the lucidity that fear steals, because I understood that our defense wouldn't be made only of locks and protocols, but of organization. Tomorrow I would enter my house with the police and make an inventory of every paper, every photo, every old receipt, not for the intruder but for myself, because only those who know their own history can recognize when someone is trying to rewrite it. Before turning out the lights, I said a short, unadorned prayer, asking for clarity and memory to connect the dots without imagining monsters where there are only mediocre men, and clarity to not underestimate mediocre men when they organize themselves. Emma fell asleep quickly, and I sat a little longer, listening to the ordinary sounds of Anne's house, the refrigerator pipe, the window creaking softly, the neighbor's footsteps on the gravel, and I thought that normality is a music we only notice when it's in danger of ending. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to a notification on my cell phone. The bank informed me that someone had tried to validate a mailing address in another city using my married surname and a phone number that wasn't mine. I clicked on the alert, confirmed the block, took a deep breath, and felt a wave of pure anger overwhelm my fear. Anger that doesn't scream, anger that organizes. And I wrote down, next to my bed, 3 names and 2 places I needed to revisit. With the police, the arrested brother-in-law, the 2 silent ex-son-in-law, the man with the fence, the hospital parking lot, and the old collection agency that once harassed my mother-in-law over a lien I never understood. I went back to bed. But before closing my eyes, I wrote on a loose sheet of paper in large letters for myself to read when I woke up. It's not about today, it's about the trail. And I promised myself, grandmother with the scent of lavender and hands calloused from home, that the trail would be ours, that I would walk it with the patience of someone peeling apples without rushing until each piece found its place, even if that meant confronting family members and stirring up stories that everyone preferred to keep under their good towels. The next morning, I woke to the shy sunlight streaming through the curtains of Anne's house, and with the feeling that my bones were heavier than usual. I made strong coffee, sat at the table, and before any conversation, I opened the sheet of paper I had written the night before. It's not about today, it's about the trail. I read it quietly, like someone reading a prayer, and understood that that day needed to be dedicated to setting foot on that trail, even if each step revealed more mud than road. Emma woke up sleepy, came to me, and asked for pancakes, and that childish, so normal request was a cruel reminder of how simple life should be. As she mixed the batter, she commented almost absently that she'd dreamed about her mother again, and that this time the voice was telling me to look for the boxes in the attic, and my hands shook so badly I almost spilled the milk on the counter. I hadn't told Emma about the boxes in my attic, full of papers I'd saved over the decades, papers I'd often forgotten about. I called the police officer in charge of the case and asked him to accompany me to the house. I explained about the boxes, Emma's dream, and the folder that might have been stolen. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds before he replied that he would arrange an escort for that afternoon. "Go prepared," he said, and that simple phrase echoed in me like a sentence. Prepared for what? To confirm that my entire life was exposed? To discover that someone within the family was involved? To face the fact that the roots of our story were more twisted than I imagined? While I waited, I made a list from memory of the boxes in the attic. Folders of my mother-in-law's old documents, insurance receipts, land sales papers, letters my husband kept from his time at the power company, even drafts of debts I thought had already been settled. I realized that for someone who makes a living manipulating identities and names, this was gold. And suddenly I understood. The intruder wasn't after just a piece of paper, but a mosaic, a set of clues that would allow them to piece together our financial history like someone piecing together a puzzle of dirty opportunities. At noon, the police car pulled up in front of Anne's house, and Emma ran up to me with her coat still half open, asking if we were finally going home. I told her yes, but that she would stay in the car with Anne while the officers and I went inside. She frowned but accepted, only repeating, "Mommy said not to go up there alone." The warning dropped like a stone in my stomach because I was all ready, determined to go up to the attic with officers in tow. We arrived at my house, and the yellow tape still blocked the entrance, flapping in the wind like a mournful banner. As I entered, I smelled a muffled smell of dust mixed with something chemical, perhaps from the gloves worn by the officers the day before. I walked slowly to the stairs that led to the attic, each step creaking as if complaining under the weight of the truce about to be revealed. The officers lit the way with flashlights, and I, standing behind them, felt my heart pounding in my temples. As we opened the wooden lid that led to the attic, a wave of stale air hit us. The smell of paper, dry wood, and stored memories. Flashlights swept over stacked boxes, some marked with pen, others covered in dust. The officer asked me to point out where he usually kept the oldest documents, and I pointed to a corner on the right, where there were 3 brown boxes. As he approached, he noticed that one of them had its tape cut and poorly resealed, a clear sign that someone had tampered with it. My body froze. I slowly bent down and opened the box with my own hands, even against their advice. Inside, the papers were messy, envelopes torn, yellow documents thrown haphazardly. At the bottom, there was empty space, as if something had been recently removed. "What was in here?" the officer asked. I shook my head, lost in memories. Maybe my mother-in-law's briefcase, maybe letters, maybe receipts. The emptiness seemed to speak louder than any paper. In the corner of the same box, I found something I hadn't remembered. A folded photograph showing my young husband next to a man I recognized only belatedly, the father of my daughter's ex-son-in-law. My world spun a bit as I realized our families were connected not just by my daughter's marriage, but by a longer history, perhaps business, perhaps debt. And that explained why the intruders seemed so knowledgeable about what to look for. So, police officer took the photograph, put it in a plastic bag, and asked me to write down any memories I had of the man in the photo. I closed my eyes and recalled an image of a recent visit, more than 20 years ago, when my husband was talking quietly to a man in the backyard, near the now-defunct chicken coop. I hadn't paid it any attention at the time, but now the memory came flooding back. "They were talking about money," I whispered. "A family debt." We descended from the attic in silence, each step heavy as lead. Emma watched through the car window, her wide eyes shining with curiosity and fear. I tried to smile reassuringly, but my face wouldn't budge. Outside, Anne asked me if we'd found anything. I simply replied, "More questions than answers." And it was the truth. Back in the room, the officers conducted a preliminary inventory, recording what was intact and what appeared disturbed. Among the scattered papers, I found old letters addressed to my mother-in-law, some collections, others from the bank. One of them mentioned a lien on a piece of land in another city, signed with surnames that now overlap with those of my ex-son-in-law. The past insisted on intertwining with the present, as if our family tree had rotten roots scattered beneath the yard. As the officers chatted among themselves, I heard Emma tap on the car window, getting my attention. I hurried out, and she said calmly, "Grandma, he was watching from here." I asked, "Who?" And she pointed to the end of the street. When I looked, all I saw was a dark car turning the corner. But the certainty in her gaze cut through me like a knife, I told the police, who wrote down the partial license plate Emma had managed to read. They said they would investigate, but asked me not to return to the house alone for now. I told them I wouldn't feel safe anywhere, but I complied. We closed the door, resealed the tape, and set off back to Anne's, our heads full of images that didn't add up. On the way, Emma sat silently, staring out the window until she said, "Mommy said they want what was promised a long time ago." I glanced at Anne, who was driving, and saw her eyes harden. Long promised? That sounded like a debt, like a pact. And I, a grandmother with calloused hands and a weary heart, knew I was only beginning to understand the depth of the net that held our family captive. That night, I sat at the table with Anne and spread out the papers we'd brought from the attic. The yellowed letters spoke of loans, pledges, and unpaid contracts. In all of them, There was something in common. Our family names, linked to the names of our ex-son-in-law's family. It was as if we were trapped in a cycle of debt and collections that spanned generations. I realized with bitterness that this wasn't just a raid seeking quick cash. It was a cursed inheritance that was finally taking its toll. The next day, I woke up with a firm decision. I could no longer avoid the confrontation. I needed to face my daughter's ex-son-in-law, look him in the eye, and understand his true meaning. If his family was involved in my husband's and mother-in-law's old debts, and if his brother-in-law had already been caught inside my house, it was impossible to believe it was all a coincidence. As a grandmother who had already endured grief and separations, I knew that the worst pain was doubt. Before leaving, I prepared Emma for the day with Anne. I made sure to kiss her forehead and assure her she would be safe, even though my heart ached to leave her. Emma, however, seemed to understand more than a child should. She looked me in the eye and said, "Grandma, be careful what he says, because he lies as if it were the truth." That sentence echoed within me as I closed the door. It wasn't just a daughter's warning, it was almost a prophecy. I arranged to meet at a discreet cafe downtown. I asked him to come alone, and to my surprise, he agreed without question. I arrived early, sat by the window, and watched every car that passed, every person who entered. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread contrasted with the storm I knew I was about to face. When he walked in, my stomach dropped. He was thinner, his beard unkempt, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, always attentive to every detail. He sat across from me without smiling. He ordered only black coffee. There were no hugs, no cordiality, just tense silence, punctuated by the clink of cups all around. Why were they after the papers in my house? I asked bluntly. He arched his eyebrow, feigning surprise. Papers? What papers, Mrs. Marlene? He used my name as if to diminish my position. I didn't back down. I slammed my hand on the table and said, "Don't lie to me. Your brother-in-law was caught in my kitchen. He didn't go in there to steal the television. He was looking for documents." He took a deep breath, took a sip of coffee, and let the silence work like a weapon. Only then did he speak. "My family had old business dealings with your late husband, things that were never resolved, debts, promises, papers proving that what was rightfully owed was not paid." My heart raced. My husband's shadow, which I had always carried as an honest memory, was now under suspicion. "My husband would never hide anything from me," I replied, my voice trembling but firm. He leaned forward and said softly, "He didn't hide it. He just didn't tell. Because sometimes telling someone is like opening a wound that won't heal." The words were razor sharp. I felt as if I was sitting before a lawyer on trial, not a man who had once been part of my family. I asked what exactly they wanted. He replied, "There are documents proving that the house you live in today was used as collateral in an old lien. If this folder disappears, the debt disappears. But if it turns up, we'll reclaim what's ours." The sentence sounded like a direct threat. The house I'd built with my husband, where I'd raised my daughter, where I was now making memories with my granddaughter, was at stake. I gripped the cup tightly, trying to hide the trembling in my hands. "So you broke into my home to steal papers that might not even exist?" I asked. He smirked and said, "They do exist, and we know your mother-in-law kept them. Whether they're in the attic or have already ended up somewhere else doesn't matter. But we'll find them." My blood boiled. I slammed my hand on the table again, making his cup tremble. "You're not going to steal what doesn't belong to you. If there's something to be resolved, let it be through the courts, not by breaking into a family home and scaring children." He stared at me, unblinking, and said, "Justice is for those who have time. We're in a hurry." I stood up, ready to leave, but he grabbed my arm tightly. "Miss Marlene, Don't interfere anymore. Leave this to us. Because anyone who interferes where they shouldn't end up getting hurt. I roughly pushed his hand away and said, staring him down, I've been hurt enough. Now it's my turn to fight. And I left the cafe with my heart burning. Outside, I took a deep breath. The cold street air felt like it was biting my skin, but it also cleared my mind. I picked up my cell phone and called the officer in charge. I recounted every word, every threat, every detail of the encounter. He asked me to come to the police station immediately to give another statement. I agreed, but first I called Anne to let her know I was on my way. On the way to the police station, I felt like I was being followed. A black car with dark tint kept its distance, but not enough to fool me. I took different turns and turned onto side streets, but he kept following me. My heart was pounding like a drum. I turned on the speakerphone and let the police hear my heavy breathing and the screeching of the tires. The officer asked me to remain calm and drive to the station without stopping. I followed his instructions, and when I turned the corner onto the main street, a patrol car was already in position. The black car sped off and disappeared before anyone could intercept it. But I knew. They had been watching me the whole time. At the police station, I described the car, the conversation, the threats. The officer took quick notes and said, "This isn't just a home invasion anymore. It's organized crime. And now you're at the center of it." The sentence hit me like a punch. I, a grandmother who only wanted to take care of her granddaughter, was now the target of a network that used old documents as weapons. I returned to Anne's house, exhausted but determined. Emma ran to me, put her arms around my waist, and asked if I was okay. I said yes, but she looked at me deeply and said, "Grandma, Mommy said the worst is yet to come." My body froze. If a child could feel that way, I knew the storm was just beginning. That night I sat on the couch, Emma sleeping in my lap, and promised myself I wouldn't let any debts from the past destroy our future. I would face whoever I had to. Because when you have a granddaughter who whispers, "Run," and saves your life, you learn that courage isn't optional, it's inherited. The morning after the confrontation at the cafe, I woke up feeling like the walls were closing in around me. The silence of Anne's house, which had once brought me some comfort, now seemed like a harbinger of something bad. I went out onto the porch, the cold air biting my skin, and noticed fresh tire tracks on the street, right in front of the gate. It was no coincidence. They were stalking us. The whole city felt under surveillance, as if every corner had eyes. I made coffee, but it tasted too bitter. Anne tried to calm me down, saying it might just be a random neighbor. I shook my head. A woman my age learns to distinguish the common from the suspicious, and this was suspicious. Emma, still in her pajamas, came running and sat on my lap. "Grandma, Mommy said you can't leave the house alone today." The warning hit me like a silent thunderclap. I called the police officer in charge and told him about the tire tracks. He responded cautiously. "They want to intimidate, but make no mistake, Miss Marlene. Intimidation is the first step before the real attack." His words echoed in my chest. With each passing minute, the web of threats tightened. I wasn't just in the middle of a paper fight. I was in a silent family war, where past and present intertwined in debts and secrets. We decided Emma wouldn't go to school that week. Anne agreed to keep her close, but I could see in my granddaughter's eyes that she understood too much. That night, when I tucked her in, she held my hand and said, "Mommy's scared, but she said she trusts you." My eyes filled with tears. I, who had always tried to be the family's rock, was now the last shield between generations. The next day, I returned to my house with the police to try to find more clues. As soon as I walked in, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air was different, heavier, as if someone had breathed it hours before. I glanced around the room and noticed a chair was out of place. Someone had come in again, even with all the caution tape. The police confirmed that there were signs of a forced entry at the back door. We searched every room, and in the guest room, I found something that made me tremble. A manila envelope purposely left on the bed. Inside were copies of my mother-in-law's old documents, lien receipts, contracts, and letters. But along with them was a handwritten note. "You can't hide what already belongs to us." My heart raced. This wasn't just a threat, it was a direct message. They had access, they had copies, they knew exactly what they were looking for. I took the note to the police, and the older officer shook his head, muttering, "They want to play on your fear. They want you to hand over what's left." But I knew there was nothing left but doubts and fragments. That night, I could barely sleep. The sound of rain hitting the roof sounded like footsteps on the house. I got up several times to check the doors and windows, even though I was at Anne's house. Emma woke up to my movements and came to lie down beside me. "Grandma, Mommy said they'll try to trick you by showing you things that seem true but aren't." The warning was all too clear. They were manipulating documents, fabricating stories, distorting the story. The next day, I returned to the police station and showed the note. The officer explained that falsifying documents was a common tactic in fraud rings. But what frightened me most was his suggestion that perhaps someone inside our town's old registry office was involved, providing copies of records. In other words, it wasn't just family against family. There were outsiders profiting from this. As I left the police station, I saw the black car parked on the corner. The tinted windows reflected the sunlight like lidless eyes. My legs felt shaky, but I kept walking, pretending not to notice. I got into Anne's car and told her to drive faster. Emma, in the back seat, watched silently, but her eyes reflected something more than fear. They reflected a quiet understanding of danger. Back at Anne's house, I received an unexpected call. A male voice, different from the previous one, simply said, "It's time to negotiate. Show up alone tomorrow night at the old railroad shed. If not, your family will pay." My blood ran cold. The voice didn't ask for money, it didn't ask for ransom. It asked for my presence. It was a trap, but also a chance to understand how far this would go. I told the police everything, but they urged caution. They said it might be bait to lure me out. They suggested sending someone in my place. But deep down, I knew there was no substitute. The threat was personal. And somehow, I felt I had to face that night. As a grandmother, as a guardian of history, as a woman who no longer had room to retreat. That afternoon, I sat with Emma and Anne at the table and explained that I needed to leave. Anne despaired, saying it was crazy. Emma, on the other hand, just looked at me and said, "Grandma, Mommy said, if you go, go with faith, but don't go alone." That made my skin crawl. I decided I would go with the police, but that I would enter the warehouse with my own eyes to see who was behind it all. When night fell, I donned my heaviest coat and hid a small tape recorder in my pocket. The police followed me in discreet cars, keeping their distance. The old railroad depot sat on the edge of town, an abandoned place that smelled of rust, oil, and dust. The broken windows let in the cold wind, and the metallic sound of the sheets clanging sounded like a raging heart. I entered slowly, each step echoing in the emptiness. A flashlight switched on in the background, revealing a thin man, the same one from the fence. He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Did you come alone, Mrs. Marlene?" he asked. I took a deep breath and replied, "I'm never alone. I carry the truth with me." The sentence came out more firmly than I expected. He laughed, stepping closer, and pulled a brown folder from his pocket. That folder, the same one that had disappeared. "This is what you've been hiding for decades. and now it's going to be our currency. My heart raced. I recognized the folder immediately, but I had no idea what was actually inside. The police hadn't revealed themselves yet, waiting for the right moment. I knew that moment would define everything. I looked at the folder, at the man, and felt a strength rise within me. These papers aren't your life, nor mine. They're just old chains you insist on carrying. I won't betray my family because of this. My voice echoed in the warehouse, and for the first time I saw the man hesitate, but the hesitation was brief. He opened the folder and scattered the papers on the floor, as if he wanted to drown me in evidence. The police spotlights suddenly came on, illuminating everything. Voices shouted commands. The man tried to run, but was surrounded. The briefcase lay open on the floor, its papers flying in the cold wind. I stood there, watching the scene, as if seeing a ghost materialize. Because among the documents, I recognized a signature, my own husband's. I froze when I saw my husband's signature on one of the papers scattered across the cold warehouse floor. The world seemed to spin slowly, and for a few seconds, I heard neither the shouts of the police nor the sound of running footsteps. Just that blue pen stroke, the unmistakable curved handwriting I'd seen so many times on loving notes left on the coffee table. But this time, it was beneath a pawn agreement, linking our names to a debt I'd never known about. The younger officer collected the documents with gloves, while I knelt with difficulty, ignoring the cold cement that crept up to my knees. I scanned, each sheet of paper scattered by the wind. There were numbers, amounts, addresses. The land foreclosed, the house used as collateral, and collection letters sent in the family name, all with the same signature. My husband, the man I loved, the father of my daughter, the grandfather Emma never knew. My chest tightened as if the air had turned to lead. A mixture of sadness, anger, and betrayal washed over me. Had he hidden this on purpose? Had he died carrying a secret that now weighed heavily on my shoulders? Or had his signature been forged? The doubt hurt more than any ready answer. Emma wasn't there to see it, but her voice seemed to echo in my head. Mommy said they'll try to trick you. Was that it? Were those papers staged, farces created to break me down? Or was it that deep down the truth was truly hidden, and now it was coming to exact its toll? The older officer placed his hand on my shoulder and urged me to remain calm. He said the documents would be analyzed, that experts would verify the authenticity of the signature. But the coldness with which he spoke only increased my dread. Because, by the time he concluded, the ghost of doubt would already be gnawing at my soul. I was taken back to the police car, and on the way back, I couldn't speak. I just stared out the window, watching the city lights flash by, like memories that refused to stop before my eyes. With each streetlight we passed, it felt like a piece of my life was hanging from it. Arriving at Aunt's house, I found Emma awake, even though it was the middle of the night. She ran to me, cupped my face in her small hands, and said, "Grandma, you look pale." I didn't have the courage to tell her what I'd seen. I just hugged her tightly, as if trying to hold on to the only purity I had left. Anne noticed my expression but didn't ask anything. She simply made hot tea and left me in silence. That night I dreamed of my husband. He was sitting on the porch, as he did in the summers, with a glass of iced tea in his hand and that tired smile. But in the dream, he wasn't looking at me. He was staring straight ahead at the road, as if waiting for someone. I woke with tears in my eyes and the feeling that I didn't fully know the man with whom I'd shared decades of my life. At breakfast, Emma came to me with a drawing. It was our house, but on the roof she'd drawn a black shadow, like a cloud that never goes away. "Grandma, Mommy said this is on top of us until you fix it." My heart ached. How do you explain to a child that adulthood is sometimes made up of debts that drag on beyond death? I spent the day with the police reviewing the documents they'd collected. From the warehouse, they carefully showed me every detail. Some signatures were indeed my husband's, confirmed in old records. Others, however, appeared copied, forged. It was as if they'd mixed truths and lies to create a labyrinth impossible to escape. I understood in that moment that my husband might indeed have been involved in poorly explained business dealings in the past. But I also realized that people were manipulating the story, exploiting the gaps to increase the debt and drag our family deeper into the hole. This mixture of truth and deception was the cruelest weapon, because it confuses, divides, and destroys from within. When I returned to Anne's house, I sat in the living room and began rummaging through my own boxes of memories. I found old letters, cancelled checks, even grocery notes written by him. I placed them side by side with the papers the police had let me see. Some of the lines were identical, others were clearly fake. I felt a sharp pain. My husband might have been wrong, but not to the extent they were trying to paint. Emma watched me silently until she said, "Grandma, Mommy said Grandpa regretted it, but he didn't have time to tell me." It was like a punch in the gut. Was that regret real? Had he died carrying a burden alone, believing he was protecting me by hiding it? Or was my granddaughter just translating what I wanted to hear? I decided then that I wouldn't just wait for answers. I would get to the root of that network. Who provided the documents? Who manipulated the registry offices? Who placed trackers? If my husband had left an open wound, it was up to me to close it, but not at the expense of my home, my granddaughter, my peace. That night, I received another call. This time, the voice was calm, almost polite. "You already know your husband wasn't so innocent. Hand over what's left, and we'll leave you alone." I swallowed hard and replied, "I don't negotiate with anyone who breaks into my house." On the other end, silence. Then just a short laugh before hanging up. I walked back into the living room, sat next to Emma, and held her hand. "My dear, sometimes we have to fight for what seems already lost." She looked at me with those big eyes and said, "Mommy said the worst secret hasn't been revealed yet." My heart raced. The worst was yet to come. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood on the porch, gazing up at the starry Illinois sky, and realized that above us, the stars have always been there. What changes is the darkness we carry within. And in that moment, the darkness seemed closer than ever. The next morning was a burden. I sat on Anne's porch, covered by a thick blanket, with a cup of tea that was cooling too quickly, and stared out at the silent street. But the silence, instead of calming, gave me chills. Every shadow seemed to hide someone. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Emma slept in the room, but I could almost hear her breathing, as if reminding me not to falter. Around 3 a.m, I heard a faint noise coming from the sidewalk. I got up slowly, my heart racing, and opened the curtains a crack. A black car was parked right in front of Anne's house, its headlights off. A silhouette of someone shifted in the driver's seat. I gripped the phone with trembling hands and dialed the police. They urged me to remain calm, saying they would send a squad car. But before they could arrive, the car drove off, leaving only the smell of gasoline in the cold early morning air. In the morning, I told Emma what had happened. She listened with the strange serenity only very sensitive children possess. Then she said, "Grandma, Mommy said they're not just after the papers. They want the truth the papers hide." I was paralyzed. What truth do papers hide? What kind of truth could be buried in old contracts and debts? Something deeper than numbers? I spent the entire day rummaging through the boxes we'd brought from the attic. Among the plain papers and yellowed letters, I found a sealed envelope hidden inside my mother-in-law's old cookbook. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from my husband. The title chilled me. For when I can no longer hide. I sat at the table, my eyes welling up, and began to read. He confessed that years ago he had agreed to put up his house as collateral for a loan taken out by his ex-son-in-law's father. The money, he said, had been used to save the family business, but was never repaid. Throughout the letter he begged forgiveness, saying he hid it from me so I wouldn't worry, and that he hoped to resolve everything before he died. But death came first. My eyes filled with tears. He wasn't the perfect man I'd always believed, but he wasn't the monster they painted him to be either. He was just an ordinary man, trying to protect his family, making mistakes along the way. The problem was, those mistakes were now weapons in the wrong hands. Anne came into the room and found me crying. I showed her the letter, and together we sat in silence for several long minutes. She told me I needed to turn this over to the police immediately. I agreed, but my heart burned with rage. They were using my husband's memory against me, against Emma, and I wouldn't allow it. That night I decided to face it head on. I called my ex-son-in-law. I told him I had the truth in my hands, and that if I wanted to keep playing, I knew how to play too. He laughed on the other end of the line, that dry laugh that made me sick, and replied, "Then come show me the truth, but come alone." I arranged to meet him at an old warehouse in town, where he used to work with his father. The police were notified, but I knew that in the end, the responsibility was mine. Before leaving, Emma took my hand and said, "Grandma, Mommy said that today you'll find out who's really behind this." The weight of those words followed me to the car. The warehouse smelled of rust, mold, and neglect. I walked in with firm steps, even though my legs were shaking inside. My ex-son-in-law was there, next to two men I didn't know. One of them was holding a brown folder, the same folder. He smiled, a cold smile, and said, "Finally, you brought me what I wanted." I held up my husband's letter, waving it in the air. "Here's the truth. It's not about debt. It's about family wrongdoing. You want revenge, not justice." He reached out, trying to snatch the envelope from my hand, but I backed away. "You threatened my granddaughter, broke into my home, and placed a tracking device on my purse. This isn't debt, this is a crime." Silence fell over the warehouse. Then the man holding the briefcase stepped forward and said something that chilled me to the bone. "He's not the boss. He's just another player playing the game. The real culprit is within your family." My eyes widened. "Within my family?" I repeated. He laughed, throwing the folder on the floor. The papers scattered like dead leaves. "Look closely, Mrs. Marlene. The person who saved all this wasn't your husband. It was your mother-in-law. And the person who has kept in touch with us to this day is someone who still visits your house." My heart raced like never before. My mind began racing with names and faces. Who in my family could be involved? Who had access to the boxes, the papers, the stories? The doubt was as suffocating as the danger itself. The police entered at that moment, lights and shouts filling the warehouse. The men were surrounded. The ex-son-in-law resisted but was soon handcuffed. I stood there, helpless, staring at the papers on the floor. Among them was another short note, written in fresh handwriting. "You know who this is." I returned to Anne's house with my mind racing. Emma was waiting for me, awake, as if she knew I would arrive with a heavy load. She sat on my lap, rested, her head on my chest, and said, "Grandma, Mommy said it's not from outside. It's someone you love." I returned to Anne's house with the note pounding in my head. "You know who you are." I sat at the table, the old vinyl creaking under the chair, and let the silence surround me until the ordinary kitchen noises revealed what my mind refused to accept. The ease with which they'd entered her yard, the tire track near the gate, the tracking device discovered inside my bag while I was under her roof, the silent call answered on her landline. The suits were straight lines. I was the one who insisted on drawing them crooked to fit the comfort of loyalty. He watched Anne slowly washing the dishes, her thin ring tapping against the glass like a metronome. On the refrigerator, the shopping list written in the same thick pen I'd used to plan our defense. In the fruit bowl, the apples Emma always picked first. Hanging on the doorknob, Anne's floral apron, and, in the front pocket, a discreet volume I hadn't noticed before. The smell of dish soap, the cold light bulb over the sink, the window fogged with hot water. Every detail told me that truth doesn't live in cinematic twists. It hides in habits. I could accuse her. I could rip that pocket off like ripping off an old bandage. But I chose another path, testing her from the side of the light. I called the detective, requested an authorized wiretap, and explained my plan with the harsh calm of someone no longer old enough to be cowardly. I'm going to ask her to come to my house to help me organize the boxes in the attic. If there's a deal with anyone, they'll move. He took a deep breath on the other end and said he'd keep a team on a side street, discreet without sirens. Go prepared. That night I returned to my house with Emma and Max. I ran my fingers along the door frames like someone blessing a sick person, turned on the kettle, and turned on the yellow living room light that always gave me winter courage. The air smelled of wood, of frightened dust, of the cinnamon that still lingered in the rugs. I placed the listening device under the collar of my cardigan, took 3 deep breaths like the cardiologist taught me, and sent the message. Anne, can you come? I want to sort the papers. Only you know where everything is. She arrived with a baking dish covered in a tea towel. Lasagna, she said, to keep us strong, and the aroma of tomato and basil almost disarmed me. She put the dish in the oven, dried her hands on her apron, and hugged me with the automatic affection of sisters who learned to be adults too soon. I felt her body too light, the rush of her chest, her familiar perfume. Guilt has a smell, and that night it seemed to me the same as the soap she always used on her sheets. I led her to the table, spreading out empty folders, labels, pens. I want to have everything ready for the official tomorrow, I said, as if tossing breadcrumbs in the path of truth. Anne nodded, sat down slowly, but her eyes darted around the room as if counting exits. Emma from the hallway watched silently, her hair tied in a simple ponytail, her star-spangled nightgown reflecting the warm light. "Grandma, Mommy told you not to go upstairs alone," she repeated, and I felt the sentence settle on me like an ancient hand. The phone vibrated in Anne's apron pocket. She reached for it, hesitated, and turned to the side, as if seeking privacy indoors. Through the fold of the fabric, I glimpsed the bottom of the screen for a moment, a nameless number ending in the same 4 digits I'd memorized in the car when the threatening voice called. Anne answered, whispering, "Not now," and I heard her say, "I'll see what I can do." No metaphor can describe the noise it made inside me. It was the sound of fine china breaking in the sink of my childhood. "Anne," I called, my voice unwavering, "who's asking you to see what you can do?" She bit her lip, her eyes searching for a future where the answer would fit. "Yeah, it's their intermediary," she said in a whisper. "They swore they'd leave you alone if I helped them." "Get the briefcase back. That's the only reason I allowed it, that I gave them the news, that I left the gate half open that night, that—" Emma took a step. Max growled softly. The world, for a second, fit into the pocket of an apron. She began to speak as if untying an old knot. Her son, my nephew, mired in rehab debt. The promise to solve everything if she would make it easier. Give me my location when I left. allow them to look at the house without violence, pressure me to hand over the papers out of fear. I never wanted to hurt. "Emma!" she cried, her hands trembling. "I just wanted to stop the calls, with the man in the cap hanging around." The tracker, she admitted, had been glued to my bag by a young man who came into the living room for just a minute while she went to get coffee. "And the briefcase?" I asked, and the question seemed to drag the house away. "I didn't take it," I said, with a sincerity that hurt. "But I told them you suspected the attic. They sent someone else in after the police. I thought you'd never see it. I was desperate, Marlene." My name on my sister's lips hurt more than any 4 digits. Emma leaned her head against the door frame and softly, as always, whispered, "Grandma." Not run this time, but a call to stand. I asked Anne to repeat everything calmly. She repeated it, stumbling over tears, over promises, over, "I swear it was the last time." As she spoke, a beacon of light discreetly swept across the room's wall, the team lurking, vigilant, waiting for confirmation. "They're coming," she confessed suddenly, her fingers tightening in her apron pocket. "Today, they said if I didn't give them something, they'd come get it." They knocked on the door with their knuckles, a knock too polite for someone who deserves no politeness. Before I could move, the man by the fence, thin, wearing a cap, the same cynical smile from the shed, crossed the frame with the agility of someone rehearsing an exit. He saw the folders, saw Emma, saw Anne with her cell phone still warm, and said, "Conversation over." Max advanced with a snap, foaming with courage and loyalty, stopping the intruder's steps as if he were a hedge. Time at home changes density at the moment of confrontation. The man raised his arm in a brutal gesture. E, in a long-held reflex of a mother and grandmother, placed my body in front of Emma. The cardigan brushed against the wiretap microphone, and the room flooded with blue light in a sigh of tires. "Police!" The night exploded from inside my living room, as if the paintings on the walls had a voice. The man tried to run to the back, but found the firm shadow of 2 officers. The cold metal bit into my wrists, and the sound of handcuffs sounded for the first time like music I recognized. The radio blared code names. The house returned to the posture of someone bearing their own story, and I found myself kneeling on the carpet, Emma clutching my neck and Max panting beside me, victorious and trembling. Anne, leaning against the wall, slid down to a sitting position, her face wet, her fingers clutching her apron as if trying to sew back together the fabric of what had been torn. They took the man, collected cell phones, flash drives, and notes. An officer asked me to choose between anger and testimony. I chose testimony. I went to the police station with Emma and Anne, one with her hand in mine, the other with her hands in her lap, learning the price of just one more time. In the office, the white overhead light stripped everything of its meaning, and it was without meaning that Anne recounted meetings, phone calls, amounts, names. In the end, she signed. "I agree to answer for what I did," he said, and there was truth there, hard, unvarnished. The following days were a moral and legal inventory. The forensic examination confirmed what my heart already knew. Some of my husband's signatures were genuine, some were skillful fraud. The prosecutor pieced together the puzzle. Ex-son-in-law indicted for collusion and extortion, brother-in-law for trespassing and aggravated theft, the fence man and the so-called middleman for criminal association, document forgery, and more. Lines I learned to read unintentionally. The notary offices involved underwent audits. The hospital reinforced security in the parking lot. And, at the hearing, an agreement was reached. The true old debts would be discussed in court, without threats, without the house at risk, clean paper, sunshine. I returned to the cemetery on a windless afternoon. I brought simple flowers and a letter I'd written in the early hours. You made a mistake trying to protect. I almost made a mistake trying to deny. Now I protect by telling everything. I placed my palm against the cold stone, listened to the distant whistle of a train in the background, the same sound that had lingered in me since the warehouse, and let forgiveness flow slowly, without spectacle, like a tap slowly turning off. The following week I changed the locks, installed cameras, and turned up the porch lights. But that wasn't what gave me back my sleep. What gave me back my sleep was sitting with Emma and my daughter, on a rare Sunday when I wasn't on duty, and opening the boxes in the attic in the middle of the living room, in the daylight, paper by paper, name by name, story by story, until no shadows could fit inside. Shame is not an inheritance when we choose clarity as our will. Anne responds freely, working with the public defender's office, doing everything she can to repair what she's broken. Sometimes she calls me late, her voice low, asking to hear Emma say good night on speakerphone, as if that sound could draw the courage she lacked when fear struck. I answer. I listen. Because justice is what the state does. Restoration is what we strive for, with patience, with limits, with a lasagna still waiting in the freezer for when forgiveness is more appropriate. At night, I still wake with my ear trained for shadows. Max takes 2 steps, nuzzles my hand, and I've learned to fall back asleep repeating like a mantra. I know the trail, I know the exits, I know the house. Emma sometimes appears at the bedroom door and asks if she can lie down for a while. She lies curled up, and before falling asleep, she whispers, "It's okay, Grandma," in the same voice that told me run that night. I've discovered that life demands courage in small steps, getting up, boiling water, turning on the porch light, making a list, asking for help. Not all the knots have been untied. The prosecutor is still searching for the name who signed the orders at the top of the network. The newspapers call it the third man. I call it the one left over. Perhaps I'll die without knowing who it was, but I've learned not to build a house on questions. I build on what I can answer, that my granddaughter saved me, that my sister got lost and asked for a map, that my daughter deserves past told in every syllable. Last week I repainted the porch. The smell of fresh paint mingled with that of coffee, and the morning light hit the glass like a simple promise. I hung a wind chime I bought at the corner store. The soft sound, whenever the air shifts, reminds me to look around without panic, with presence. And every now and then, when the bell rings, Emma smiles and asks if I hear Mommy. I reply that I hear both. Her mother watching from afar, and my mother from far away, saying the phrase that stuck with me when everything snapped. If the house talks when it shouldn't, listen with your feet. And that's what I do now. I listen, with my feet, with my hands, with my memory. I walk through the rooms slowly, grateful for the walls that still shelter me, and the truths I no longer need to hide. I lock the door with 2 turns of the key, check the gate, and say goodnight to Max. Before turning out the light, I look at the 3-generation Polaroid on the bookshelf and understand that running sometimes is just shifting places within oneself. From fear to preparation, from secrecy to voice, from inherited guilt to the story told. And if one day the house starts speaking out of turn again, I already know my granddaughter will whisper and I will listen. Because listening saved my life.